Well, thank you for joining us. My name is Kent Hovind. I was a high school science teacher 15 years. What you're about to watch on this videotape is a debate on the subject of creation and evolution. It's my great privilege now for many years to be able to debate against those who believe in the theory of evolution. I believe without apology that the Bible is the infallible, inspired, inerrant word of the living God. I tell folks I believe it from cover to cover. I even believe the cover on mine says Kent Hovind, and I believe that. And what I want to do as I do these debates, I want to strengthen your faith that the Bible is indeed correct. And the evolution theory is a trick of the devil to lead people to hell. The devil doesn't believe in evolution. But if he can get you to believe in evolution, you won't believe the Bible, and you won't start looking for Jesus Christ to be your Savior. The devil has tricked many people with this theory, and I'm sure he's laughing at him for believing. He's laughing at these people for believing this theory of evolution. I'd encourage you to watch carefully. If there's any subjects brought up in this debate that are left unfinished or not to your satisfaction, give us a call. We'll be glad to answer any questions. Thanks so much for joining us. As Mr. Prewitt said, my name is Kent Hovind. I was a high school science teacher for 15 years. We moved here to Pensacola 8 years ago to put my wife through college at Pensacola Christian College. She got her degree there and then got her degree here at the University of West Florida in music. I've been involved in education for quite some time. As I said, I taught high school 15 years, and I got my doctorate in education. I've been traveling for the last 6 years, speaking full-time on the subject of creation, evolution, and dinosaurs. I get to go all over the country and out of the country once in a while. And I think the subject of creation and evolution is probably one of the foundation subjects, because all of our other philosophies come from our basic belief in our origins. There were basically only two options. Like the Russian astronomer said, I believe it was here, the Russian astronomer came several years ago. He started off his speech by saying, folks, either there is a God or there isn't. Both possibilities are frightening. If there is a God, we better find out who he is and what he wants and do what he says. If there is no God, then we're in trouble, because we're hurtling through space at 66,000 miles an hour and nobody's in charge. A frightening thought. So I have a couple of charts here. I want to explain what I believe as a biblical, a Bible-believing, literal creationist. I believe the biblical account is literally true and scientifically accurate, just as it is written. So I'll explain the creation view of history, and we'll take all the questions you want. If you have a question, just go to the mic, and that would be easier for us. I have timelines here to indicate the two basic differences of opinion. The Bible teaches pretty clearly, if you add up the dates given in the book of Genesis and in Luke and several places, if you add up all the dates given, the Bible says the earth was created about 6,000 years ago. Not millions and billions. It was instantly created in 6 days. That's what I believe, a mature, fully functioning creation done in 6 days. And then the Bible says 4,400 years ago there was a flood when this world was destroyed. Noah built the ark and saved all the animals on board. The time before the flood was very different. People used to live to be 900 years of age. And most ancient cultures, like the Greek mythology and stuff, many of those ancient cultures talk about a time when people used to live to be nearly 1,000, called the Golden Age. I believe they're probably a messed up version of the literal biblical account of the time when people lived to be 900 plus years of age, before the flood. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I cover in my seminars when I've got 10 hours on why they used to live to be 900. After this flood came, and by the way, they have now been uncovered in anthropology, I guess is the best word for it, 250 different flood legends, different cultures that talk about a worldwide flood with a family saved in a boat. And they're all, variations of, I think, the same theme of Noah's flood. I believe, as a Bible-believing Christian and a creationist, that the dinosaurs fit right into history. They were created in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. They were just big lizards. And Noah took dinosaurs onto the ark. Probably babies. He'd be smart enough to figure that out. You don't have to bring the biggest ones you could find, bring 2 small ones. Just be sure to get a pink one and a blue one. And then after the flood, I think 2 things happened to the dinosaurs. I think the climate killed off most of them because the climate was different. They couldn't live to be 900 anymore, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So they couldn't grow as big or get as old. The second thing happened to the dinosaurs was man's hunting. Back in those days, they called them dragons. They didn't have the word dinosaur until 1841. So they called them dragons, and they killed off most of the dragons back shortly after the flood, within the first 1,000 years or so. And I believe there could possibly be a few stragglers still alive today, which is why there have been 11,000 people that claim they have seen the Loch Ness Monster. and they say it's a plesiosaurus, a dinosaur still alive. There have been 20 trips into the central part of Africa, into the Congo swamp, where they say there are still small 20-foot apatosauruses, long neck, long-tailed dinosaurs, still alive right now. Now, I don't know, I've never seen one, okay, but I know there are about 20,000 reported sightings of dinosaur-like creatures in this century from about 200 different places in the world. I think if there are dinosaurs alive today, they're very rare and much smaller than they used to be, but I think the idea of them living millions of years ago is simply not true. Now, the humanist worldview of history, if I can call it humanist for lack of a better term, what's taught in the textbooks at the secular universities and at the public schools is that the whole universe started 20 billion years ago with a big bang. And then they will say 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth cooled down and developed a hard rocky crust. And then volcanoes started going off and atmosphere developed and it rained on the rocks for several billion years, and finally turned into soup, and the soup came alive about 3 billion years ago. This is a simplification of what is in the textbooks. If you boil away all the fluff and feathers, this is what you get. They teach there was a big bang 20 billion years ago, the Earth formed 4.6 billion years ago, the rocks came alive 3 billion years ago. Some say 3.8, it depends on which textbook you're reading. And then this early life form slowly developed, evolved into all the different life forms that we have today. So to simplify it in a nutshell, everything today that's alive came from a rock. The rock came from a big bang, and the big bang came from where something exploded, but they don't know what. There are those who think there was a cosmic quirk where nothing became everything, and so basically nothing turned to everything, which turned to life. That's a simplification of the evolutionist worldview of history. Now, if we're going to discuss the theory of evolution and take questions, one thing we must do is define the word. I have learned over the years that this word evolution has two very different meanings, which are unrelated, by the way. I have this chart to illustrate the difference between the two different meanings of the word evolution. And so you'll understand what I'm talking about when I say the word evolution. There is macroevolution and microevolution. I have a huge collection of science textbooks that are used in our public school system. I've noticed some of the newer ones, the 97 edition that I saw 2 days ago when I was up in Sylacauga, Alabama. The 97 edition textbooks have a section on micro and macroevolution. They're distinguishing between the two. I say that's great. That's a start. Microevolution would be actually a better word for that is just a variation. It's not really evolution in the sense of the word, but for instance, a dog can produce a variety of dogs. Probably the Great Dane and the Chihuahua came from a common ancestor, and it was a dog. But nobody has ever observed a dog produce a non-dog. Nor has anybody ever seen a dog come from a non-dog. So Darwin got all nervous and upset about the definition of the word species. I don't even argue about that. The species is kind of a nebulous term. They say if it's not interfertile, you know, it's not the same species. Well, I don't know if that's even a good breaking point, but probably dogs and wolves and coyotes and hyenas are all in the same kind. They're the same kind of animal. They're still in the dog. I hate to use the word family because that's part of Linnaeus's classification system, but we'll use the word family. They're the same kind of animal. They're a dog. And lots of variations are possible, from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane. But the variations have limits. You can try to crossbreed dogs and get bigger and bigger dogs, but I guarantee you will never get a dog as big as Pensacola. It won't happen. There are limits to the changes. And you will never get a dog as small as a flea. They do have a lot of variation, but that's not evolution at all. That's just a variation. It's still a dog. And the Bible says God made the animals to bring forth after their kind. And that's all we've ever observed. And if science deals with things that are observable, testable, demonstrable, all we've ever observed is variations. No real evolution. And it's that roses produce a variety of roses. Some estimates are that there are 800 varieties of roses right now. The original wild rose only had 5 petals. And through mutations and selective breeding and all this kind of stuff, they've developed roses with all sorts of petals. There's yellow ones and white ones and red ones, but they're still a rose. Most of the variations that have been produced by man over the last few thousand years would not survive in the wild. If you turned all the dogs in the world loose back into the woods, how long would the Chihuahuas last? He'd come up to a wolf, you know, yap, 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 crunch. It wouldn't last 5 minutes. So most of the variations that we see, like Chihuahuas and the Shar-Pei that's all wrinkled up, they wouldn't last long in the wild at all. They've been produced by man through selective breeding for a very particular purpose, like to be a lap dog or the dachshund, to chase the weasels down the hole or something like that. But the more wild you get in your variations, the less likely they are to survive in nature. You would probably, if you turned all the dogs loose into the world, after a few generations, end up with just 1 or 2 variants available, kind of like the Australian dingo or the wild dog is basically what they would end up melting back into that type of animal. That's the only one that would survive in nature. So microevolution is observable. We can see it happen. I don't argue with it at all. It is a fact that bacteria become resistant to drugs over time. That's not evolution. It started off a bacteria and it ends up a bacteria. That's still a bacteria. That doesn't prove that we all came from a rock. So variations, that they can be pointed out by the thousands. No question there are variations. There are variations in the human skull thickness and in the eyebrow thickness and in the placement of the skull on the neck, the occiput and atlas and the bones back there. And some people carry their head forward more and some carry it straight more. And there are variations in this room. We could line up the people in this room and show all sorts of variations, but they're still human. Microevolution is observable. It is scientific. It meets all the qualifications of being a science. It's observable, it's testable, it's demonstrable. And it is scriptural. This matches what the Bible says. The animals bring forth after their kind. That's all we've ever observed. Now, this does not prove that dogs and roses have a common ancestor. What happens, I'm afraid, in our school system, and I collect the public school textbooks and speak in public schools all the time, we are showing the students many, many examples of microevolution and then tricking them into making a giant leap of faith into believing that that is somehow evidence for macroevolution. And nothing could be further from the truth. Macroevolution is assumed. Nobody has ever observed any macroevolution. It can't be found in the fossil record, and it can't be found going on today. No examples whatsoever of anything changing to a fundamentally different kind. Macroevolution is unscriptural. I would say from this side of the chart over is science, from this side back is religion. So I will often use the phrase, evolution is a religion. It is not a science. And I'm referring to macroevolution. It is purely religious. You must believe that somehow everything came from nothing. You can believe that if you want, but don't call that science. That's never been observed. Nobody's ever observed nothing turn to something. The macroevolution philosophy must believe, with a capital B, it's their religion, they must believe that matter organizes itself. And yet all we've ever observed from science is that the second law of thermodynamics seems to be universal. Everything is falling apart. Nothing is getting more organized. Some people will give examples like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly as an example of evolution. Well, that's not evolution. That's all pre-coded in the DNA structure. That's just the butterfly following a very specific pattern, a very complex code that was already laid out. Or a baby growing into a full-grown human. They say that's an example of a reversal of the second law of thermodynamics. Oh, no, it's not. You follow all the laws of, you follow the second law of thermodynamics as you grow. You have to take in enormous amounts of food to get just a little bit of growth. Very inefficient. Average person to gain 150 pounds from birth would probably have to take in several tons of food. Very inefficient system as far as growth, and it's all based on the DNA code. It was coded in from birth. It's miraculous. It's an example of creation. So the idea of macroevolution, that we all came from a rock, basically, I think is religious. I don't care if somebody wants to believe that. That doesn't bother me. I don't care what you believe. What bothers me is I have to pay for that to be taught in our school system as if it is science, and it's not science. So this word evolution really must be defined into the two different unrelated meanings, micro and macro. Oftentimes we're shown examples of some skeleton that they find, like Lucy, and this is supposed to be an example of evolution because Lucy had thicker femur bones, the thigh bone, and the bone was angled off, coming off the knee joint, a slight angle to it, indicating it was, learning to walk upright. Lucy, first place, I would point out that I don't believe this at all, but going from an ape to a human is a relatively minor change compared to going from a rock to a human. And ultimately, the evolutionist, at least the atheistic evolutionist, must believe that everything started off from a rock, and the rock came from nothing. And I said, like I said, I don't believe it. I don't care if somebody wants to believe that, but I resent that being paid for by my tax dollars, and I resent the students being taught that as if it is science. So if you, I was at Westchester University in Pennsylvania several months ago, and one of the students was a senior anthropology student. He got upset because I said that evolutionists believe everything came from a rock. He said, we don't believe we all came from a rock. I said, you don't? He said, no. I said, well, let me ask you a question. Did I summarize the evolution position fairly? Do you believe there was a Big Bang 20 billion years ago? He said, well, yes, 18 to 20, we don't know the age. And I said, do you believe the Earth cooled down and formed a hard rocky crust 4.6 billion years ago? He said, yes. I said, do you believe the rocks got rained on and slowly turned into soup and the soup came alive 3 billion years ago? He said, well, yes. I said, so you believe we came from a rock? He said, no, I don't believe that at all. I said, let me run this by one more time. And I went through this is precisely what is taught in our textbooks, folks, and this is not science. What we do is we get little examples of little minor changes clear down here in the Cambrian era. And even if you look at the chart with all the so-called family trees, they all have dotted lines. If the honest ones have dotted lines connecting these different kinds down at the bottom at the Cambrian era. First place, I don't buy the Cambrian era and all that stuff to begin with. I think the whole Earth was created 6,000 years ago, and the flood caused nearly all of the layers that we see in the strata during that one big year-long flood. And the fossils are sorted a little bit based on other factors besides evolution. The textbooks, like the Glencoe biology, which I have out in my car, said that the clams are found at the bottom of the geologic column because clams evolved first. And birds are found at the top because birds evolved last. And they show this, division of the fossils based on, the birds. And first you got the lower life forms, the simple life forms, and then fish, amphibian, reptiles, mammals, and birds. Well, there's several ways to look at that. It might be the reason clams are found at the bottom of the geologic column is because clams are the first ones to drown in a flood. They're already at the bottom. That's where they live. Of course, they're the first ones buried. And birds are found at the top because birds are the last ones to drown in a flood. The animals might be sorted in the so-called geologic column based upon their habitat or based upon their intelligence. Clams are not very bright, They couldn't avoid disaster as quickly as other animals could. They might be sorted based on their body density. Clams' shells are a little heavier than bird feathers, and so they're going to be sorted in a flood situation. The shifting and sorting of the mud just by the rising tides. If the flood lasted for a year, like the Bible says, the rising and lowering of the tides would shuffle the sediments and the dead animals down there and sort them pretty neatly based on their body structure, based on their intelligence, based on their density. It has nothing to do with evolution. So I resent, I guess, what's happening in our school system where the kids are no longer being educated, in my opinion. They're being indoctrinated. They're only being shown one side. They're being taught the humanist view. All the textbooks, just like it is a fact that you don't dare question, they will say 20 billion years ago there was a Big Bang. That is not a fact. That is a philosophy. That's one philosophy of how the world got here. But it's certainly not a scientific fact. It's certainly not observable, not demonstrable. You can't do it again. The evidence used to support this is the idea that the stars are moving away from us. The red shift is about the only evidence that the stars are moving away, and nobody knows for sure what's causing the red shift. But if it is indeed the Doppler effect of light and the stars are moving away, and then they calculate how fast they're moving and measure how far they've gone and figure, wow, this would have taken 20 billion years. Well, that all sounds good, but this is based on some real fundamental assumptions. You're assuming it all started at one point. Maybe God made the whole universe 6,000 years ago, and then people disobeyed God, and God put into effect the second law of thermodynamics, and everything began drifting off. Everything's falling apart. And it's only moved for 6,000 years. If you go down here on Interstate 10, which goes from Los Angeles all the way to Jacksonville, if you stand there on the side of Interstate 10 and see somebody headed toward Jacksonville, Florida, at 60 miles an hour, that does not prove they started in Los Angeles 5 days ago. They might have just got on at the last exit. So we are observing a little bit of movement of the stars, we think. Okay, I'll go along with that. But that doesn't prove it's been going for billions of years. And I'm I guess, very worried for our school system, because the kids are being, I think, brainwashed into believing one theory. They're not even shown the other options. Basically, either there is a creator or there isn't. They're not even shown the creation option in our textbooks, at least. Now, here at the university, I thank Dr. Prewitt for inviting me out. He's been very gracious, had me out several times. Several teachers have asked me to come out and speak. I think it's very fair that students see both sides. You don't have to believe it. You can be wrong if you'd like, but you have a right to believe whatever you want. But there are other ways to look at this. And our school system, I think, in most instances, is not educating. It's indoctrinating the students. This is what you're supposed to believe, and the kids have to be tested on that. And I resent that. So that's basically the creation view, as I see it, and the evolution view as I read it in the textbooks, and I've read hundreds of them. There may be some variations of this, but this is, in a nutshell, the humanist view of history. And if you'll take any questions you've got on that, Dr. Prewitt will give present his side of this, and then we'll take any questions that you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, well, I want to key on some specific issues and note the places where we have agreement and note the places where we have disagreement. Since Kent has very eloquently distinguished between micro and macroevolution, we can dispense with any discussion of microevolution. That is, the changes of gene frequencies in the context of environmental causes, and fix instead upon the notion of speciation or macroevolution as an evolutionary theory. I want to point out that in my definition of theory, scientific theory is merely an explanation. Theories change to fit observations, and when we have observations involving masses of evidence, which we must accommodate all of that evidence, sometimes we are forced to say, yes, we're wrong, we're going to come back with another theory. In the century since Darwin, actually close to a century and a half now, this debate has raged, specifically fixing on the notion of evolution. I would like to point out that this is a response actually to something Kent said, that if we consider the record, and I am one who espouses a theory of evolution which says that life evolved from non-life and that humans evolved from non-humans, and that human culture is a product of evolution itself and itself undergoes a kind of transformation of its own. And all of that, and I'll point out, is consistent with the second principle of thermodynamics, if we want to get into that. The second principle states that in a closed system, the quality of energy the first principle states that the quality of energy will not be, the quantity of energy will not be modified. But the second principle states that the quality of energy will tend to degrade, that energy tends to wind down. And there are a number of ways of expressing this. But the second principle of thermodynamics and the other thermodynamic principles apply to the world in much the same way that plane geometry applies to the surface of the stage. The surface of the stage is a plane for all intents and purposes, but I believe if you get up here and look closely, you'll discover that it's not a perfect plane. The only perfect plane you have is up here, all right? And the only perfect system of thermodynamics you have is up here. In the real world, all systems are open. And so evolution is, in fact, the counter of the principle of second principle of thermodynamics. It is emergent organization which results from the interaction across systemic boundaries, where environments influence particular systems, and those systems react, they become different kinds of systems. So that's the kind of evolutionary notion that I deal with, and that's one of the theoretical constructs. Much of what Kent says I agree with in other ways. Humanists have been punishing people since the 16th century. In the 16th century in England, humanists dominated the universities, and it was really, it put you in bad odor to be doing things like geometry or algebra. These were thought to be occult sciences. They, in fact, were thought to be high magic in some cases. And one of the great English scholars of the time, John Dee, who's somebody I've been working quite a bit on right now, was not the only, but he was certainly the most outlandish of those scholars who was accused of practicing witchcraft and whatnot, because he was the person who introduced into the English system the system of Christian Kabbalah, which was an adoption of Jewish Kabbalah, which is a mystical system of interpretation of the scriptures. He adopted it in as a Christian approach, and he was sort of on the outs with the humanists for doing that. Of course, he wasn't such a slick character himself. He wanted to Christianize the whole world, bring it under a Christian system under Elizabeth I of England, and then through angel magic and other forms of magic, create the kind of world in which we live, where we have, for example, videos taken. This would, I suppose, it'd be a little angel in a box rapidly painting us real fast or something. I don't know what it was going to be. But his conception of, he wanted a world like ours, and he couldn't get it through the alchemy that he was practicing, so he was prepared but he did believe that angels were real, and he did believe that they were good, and he did believe that he was a very, very good Christian, and he did believe that those angels were going to give him the ability to communicate across long distances, all this kind of thing. So there's a lot of other ideas that tie into this question of what is science and what is not science, because John Dee, in fact, was a predecessor to Robert Flood, who didn't do angel magic but did a lot of mathematics. He was running around at the same time as John Napier, who also, although he was a Scottish Protestant, developed logarithms, and there were people who were so afraid of logarithms they were not sure whether Napier was okay either. You know, the idea that you can manipulate numbers and do things like multiplication by doing addition was just a little mind-boggling for people. So the second theme was, so that's one theme is speciation. Another theme is what is science and how does science work and what are these theories anyway. Another theme is what specifically are the theories that we're talking about, like thermodynamics, those kinds of things. And a fourth is, if we're going to allow that we can critically approach the natural world, we can also allow that we should critically approach the text which forms the basis of creationism itself. And I've already alluded to Torah, or at least to Kabbalah. In Torah, it says specifically that human beings were created from a rock, or at least a pulverized rock. Humans were created from the dust of the earth. So I don't see where the inconsistency is in humans being created from a rock. Now, maybe the agent is the important difference in the two perspectives. For many Christians, or many people who believe themselves to be Christians, who call themselves Christians, who pursue a Christian spirituality, the idea that God can work in any way God chooses, including evolution, if that's the way God chooses, is not such a curious notion. And as in that context, I don't accept the idea that unless one accepts a literal interpretation of the Bible, and specifically of the Jewish, that portion of the Jewish Bible which is known as Torah in Judaism, and which has been adopted by Christianity, and most specifically by Protestant Christianity, because the Catholics really didn't care that much about the Jewish Bible for a long time. But when within, I think we have to understand that within Protestantism, the intent to create a world which is based upon the personal, or at least the group interpretation of the Scriptures, which is something the Catholic Church did not want in the 15th centuries, because it was, well, it caused a lot of political problems for them. That tradition is a tradition which continues today. Now, my little grandmother, she was a wonderful lady, and she was a Southern Baptist. When she was at that little blue-haired stage, you know, when they wash their hair and it comes out kind of blue. Well, in the 50s it did. They didn't have quite the hair care products we have today. But she would have sworn that it was the Baptists who were thrown to the lions by the Romans in the 1st century. And in fact, in a curious sort of way, she was probably correct. But my point here is that we have, in addition to a tradition of scholarly learning within universities, and not only this university, but the university across town, or the college across town that Kent has already mentioned, Pensacola Christian is a college. It's an institution of higher learning, and there are very talented faculty there. All right. In these institutions, we have always had difference. But my institution is different from the institution that preceded it, even by 2 centuries. There was a time when people like me took vows of obedience to the people that they were working for, and I know from my own actions and my colleagues' actions that that does not occur today. But I'm not sure that that's totally relevant, except that in this institution we thrive on the free exchange of different ideas. And I believe that where we introduce religion into science, we give up some of the free exchange of ideas. Not in this form necessarily, but not everyone you speak to on the subject of scientific creationism will be as articulate or as approachable as Kent Hovind. And so I want to congratulate him again. And I'm going to say one other thing. Since I've already started on Torah, yes, we were created from a rock by some agent. We're in the 1st chapter of Genesis, which critically we understand to be later than the 2nd chapter. And we also understand from the work of the Archbishop Stephen Langton that it ends at a particular point. Stephen Langton was an Archbishop of Canterbury in the 14th century, 13th century. 14th century. Anyway, he is the one who put those chapter and verse numbers in your Bible. Before that, there were all different systems for chapter and verse numbers. But the actual text of Genesis 1 ends at halfway through verse 4 of Genesis 2. We call it Genesis 2:4a and 2:4b. And anyone who's done any basic criticism is informed that, indeed, when we read the text, there are different systems for reading it, that particular numbering is a very human system, and thus very fallible, that other so-called inspired systems existed, and the only thing that makes that system better than others is that it at least is one that most of us use, and not all people use it today. But if we look at Genesis 1, what we find is God creates on the 1st day light and dark and separates the light from the dark. On the 2nd day, God creates a firmament or a barrier that separates the waters above from the waters below. On the 3rd day, God causes the waters below to pull back and exposes the earth, and thus you have earth. And plants emerge on the earth. Plants both of the leaf-bearing type and the fruit and nut-bearing type. On the 4th day, God creates the sun and the moon and the stars, the denizens of that light and dark of the 1st day. On the 5th day, God creates the fishes and the sea monsters, including probably the Loch Ness Monster, and the birds, and puts them in their appropriate places in the waters below and in the firmament or the sky or the heavens. They called it the heaven. It's called the heavens. The firmament's a curious kind of word. On the 6th day, God creates the animals, including ultimately human beings. If you look at the order of this, God is filling the places he has created in the first 3 days, the light and the dark, the waters, the heavens, the earth. And then he makes an allocation. And this is a very male God in the Jewish text, so I'm not using politically incorrect language to say that this male God created humans and then said, okay, the animals can eat the leafy plants, and the humans can eat the fruits and the nuts. These are very basic observations of the world in which we actually live, and whether it's evolved or not. These are real, it's the same world. Whoever wrote that text was looking at the same world in which we live and saw many of the same kinds of phylogenetic distinctions that biologists over the centuries have continued to observe. That we treat these phylogenetic distinctions in a different science today in no way undermines the kind of spirituality that might come from an understanding of the story of the first creation in Genesis 1 to 2:4a. And in fact, if you look at some of the New Jewish translations, some of the other translations, it begins with these words, as God began creating the heavens and the earth being a formless void, with darkness on the face of the waters, or with darkness on the face of the deep, and a mighty wind over the face of the waters, God said, let there be light. Now, in that little prolegomena to everything that happens before that, let there be light, we've got the God force, who's represented metaphorically in this text, by the way, by the word ruach, which means both spirit and wind. And in fact, the Hebrew Bible pulls this meaning right out. You get it both ways. Spirit wind created the heavens and the earth. Now that's a powerful story, and I defy anybody to say it's not a powerful story, because in fact it has shaped so much of our thinking about the world in which we live. I believe we should understand that text and other texts, whether we are in the Christian tradition or not, and I am not in the Christian tradition. I am not in the Jewish tradition. All right. But I understand them fairly well. And I believe they're very important to us because they have shaped much of our thinking of the world in which we live, and they still shape political ideals in our time. The question I want you to get to today, I hope, will be exactly what we get from, in terms of what is the payoff of denying what is our only scientific interpretation and explanation of the record we observe, because in fact the debate that we're in today was conducted over the past century and a half, and the results within science have long since been secure. Scientists simply do not accept the creationist theory because it has been invalidated in so many empirical ways. It must hinge upon a system of belief, and that is antagonistic to the very principles of science which, through a curious chain of circumstances, Protestant religion helped bring into being in our Western culture. Many other people who gave us the foundations of epistemology that give us the science we have today would have been sitting on the other side of this debate. All right. And I want you to understand that. And they were very fine people. They had a certain perspective and they had a certain knowledge at their hand. Kent will fault me for denying truths that he believes I should not deny in order to have salvation. I will fault him for denying truths that I believe he should not deny in order to be a scientist. Someday I might become a Christian. Someday he may become a scientist. And with that insult, I will turn it open to the floor.
If you have any questions, just go to the mic and line up and start off here. And direct your question to either Dr. Prewitt or myself, if you would, please. Yes, sir.
Yes, as far as the validity of Genesis itself, if the Protestant Church can throw out Maccabees and Tobit and Sirach, what makes Genesis excluded from that?
Who's that for?
Either one of us?
Well, for either or both.
You want to go first? I'll go first?
Yeah.
Nothing.
Very good.
In fact, all of the conventions, there are several. You probably have your own Bible. if you look at the Christian Bibles, including the Catholic Bible, you'll find that it ends, if you're reading along these prophecies, and it ends with a kind of a curse, which is a prolegomena to the coming of the Messiah. But in the Torah, in fact, it ends with the historical books, and you end with a blessing. So not in Torah, in the Jewish Bible, you begin with the Torah, then you go through the prophecies, and the historical books kind of conclude. So you end up with a blessing in the Jewish Bible. You end up with a kind of curse in the other Bible. So not only the selection of works to go into a Bible, but the order in which they are read becomes a significant thing. Now, these people were not Julio Cortázar, the Latin American novelist who says, doesn't matter which order you read it. They really felt that it was important that you read it in a particular order. I would make a similar comment in terms of if we say that nature must be totally consistent in order to accept evolution, then we should say that the Gospels must be totally consistent in order to accept Jesus as the Christ.
All right, I would, if I remember the question, it's been a while here.
Yeah.
That was a good answer. The Bible that I use, if you want to get into which Bible should we use and which book should be included, that's a kind of a different discussion from the creation evolution. The authority of the King James Version, for instance, or the Textus Receptus or the Masoretic text. Kind of a different discussion, but I believe there are numerous books being written all the time. Which ones should be included in the Bible? I think that was overseen by God, and God promised He would preserve His Word. So I think that if you have a specific gripe about some scientific inaccuracy in the King James Version of the Bible or the received text, which I hold to, I'd like to hear it. As far as the book of Tobit and Jasher and 1st and 2nd Maccabees and Daniel 13 and 14, the extra chapters, and I'm a little familiar with those. I think they were rejected by the people who canonized the Scripture for some very specific reasons. They didn't meet the criteria. First of all, the book had to claim to be inspired by God. It had to have been used. If the Old Testament books, it's no problem, because if they were quoted by Jesus, then they were accepted. Yeah. If they weren't quoted by Jesus or accepted by Jesus in His time, then they were added later, then they were not accepted. Maccabees would fall into those categories. They were not used at the time of Christ as Scripture. He did not ever quote from them or refer to them as being authoritative. So there was no problem. I don't know of any passages with the Old Testament that there was a problem with. With the New Testament, I think by the time the Scripture was canonized, I believe God directed the whole thing and made sure that only what He wanted was in there. Different people have different Bibles, and the only way you're going to be right on everything, of course, is to agree with me. So
let me further that question. The idea of a divine inspiration would be claimed by Eastern Orthodoxy as well as the Western Church, as well as the Protestants. Certain Protestant sects versus Catholicism.
Right.
And how do you sort that out within Christianity? I'm just curious.
Sure. Different version. Many people have claimed to be inspired, probably Buddha and Muhammad and Confucius. The Bible test was if a prophet makes one mistake, he's to be executed. He's not speaking for God. And so I'd like to see a specific error, a mistake in the Bible that I use. I've read it many, many, many times, and I think it'd be easy to point out, like in the Book of Mormon, where they say Jesus was born in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And then later it says He's born in Bethlehem. Well, that's a clear contradiction. That's enough to disqualify it from being God's Word. You may want to think it's a good book, and you may want to read it and gain some things from it, and it may make you a better person or better citizen, but it's not inspired of God. If there's a mistake, it's not from God. God says He doesn't make any mistakes, and there are none. So I think it wouldn't be hard at all to look at some of the Eastern religions where they say, the two people came down on the back of a golden goose and got off and populated the earth, or the world is on the back of a giant turtle or something like that. Those kind of things are easy to prove scientifically that they're inaccurate. And yet nobody's ever scientifically proven the Genesis account of creation is wrong. There's never been maybe many people choose not to believe it, which is fine, but there's no scientific way to prove it didn't happen that way. So the scriptural account, I think, has stood the test of time, certainly. It has certainly changed lives by the millions. There are millions who would attest to the fact that their life has been totally changed by Christianity. And I think it has never been demonstrated scientifically to be wrong.
There have been millions of people whose lives have been totally terminated by Christianity as well.
True. Yeah, well, depends what you mean by Christianity.
Right.
Some have claimed Christianity that have terminated other lives. I don't know.
I would like to add, I don't really disagree that much with what you said. Most of the scriptural bodies, we are human beings, and I'll cite, I'll quote Kenneth Pike on this because Kenneth is an eminent linguist. He was a little bit maligned in the Rise of Anthropological Theory by Marvin Harris because he was referred to as the missionary anthropologist. And he is the president emeritus of the Wycliffe Bible Translator Group, and probably the greatest phonetician in the 20th century. And when it came to these issues of epistemology, he basically said, if we had the perfect epistemology, it would be the perfect knowledge of God would be the perfect epistemology. But since I'm not God, I'm forced to use the epistemology of science and to muddle through as well as I can. Which is to say that humans are fallible, and there are contradictions throughout the Scripture. If you take the position Kent just took, then we could list all of the contradictions we want in the canonized Gospels, and there are many. And the solution to that is, well, those contradictions are errors that have been introduced by humans, and we can't do anything about them. That's not the way scientific criticism works. If a fossil is introduced into the record that doesn't make sense, it must be accommodated if it can be shown that it's not a fraud, not been constructed by somebody like the Piltdown hoax, that kind of thing. And there's this kind of self-corrective in science that says, look, we're not out, this is not big personalities thing. In the 19th century it was. In the 19th century, a lot of people like to pursue it as personalities. My great find, That's not the world in which we're living today. We have a bunch of gentle, anonymous, well, not too gentle because I have to work with some of these guys, but anonymous kind of scientists working out there. And they do a little bit, and they do a little bit, and they pull their information together, and they must account for all of it. And if something comes up that flies in the face of that interpretation and that explanation, then it must be accommodated. And so you can't say, well, that's a human error and get out of it all the time. Biblical scriptures deserve a close read, but I would argue that if we interpret biblical scriptures from our modern perspective, we will be wrong. And somebody on the way in here was asking me, what's the difference between a wife and a concubine in Torah? Well, it depends on the text and the original Hebrew word that was used, but I'm here to tell you that there wasn't a lot of difference in some of the usages. And just because it says wife in the modern English or even in the early modern English, and it's a good translation of the Hebrew word for wife, doesn't mean that what is meant by wife is the same thing as what is meant by wife today. We have words and we have meanings.
Okay, if you have a question, go line up with them.
We need more questions. Otherwise, we'll sit here and talk about this, babble. I notice a few people coming in, a few people having to leave. If you have to leave for another class, we understand that. And we're going to take a break at about, what time is it?
10:30.
We're going to take a break at about 10 till for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back in and start again. Yes, please.
Okay, I've got a question about the stratification of geologic time. Basically, if it was layered proportionately over geological time, you should have simple organisms like mussels at the very beginning. But throughout, I guess, thousands of cases throughout the Earth, we find that sometimes these layers are not layered evenly. In other words, you'll see some younger layering above older layering with no evidence of upheaval or anything. And I've just got a question for both of you. how do you explain that as a scientist?
Okay, I'll start if it's okay. I think the way the system is working today, based on Lyell and Hutton and Steno and Cuvier and some of these fellows who developed our geologic column, I think the whole thing's a hoax. Okay, the geologic column was developed in the 1800s by some Christians, some creationists, but it's very much misused. If you take a rock to a university and say, how old is it? They will then they'll ask you questions like, did you find any fossils in this area? Did you find any, they're looking for index fossils. The whole system is built on index fossils based on the assumption that evolution has happened. They start with the assumption, okay, evolution happened. We went from simple life forms to complex life forms. Then they arranged them in a fictitious imaginary order. By the way, there's no such thing as a simple life form. A paramecium is more complicated than the space shuttle. So I very much disagree with the concept or notion of a simple life form. There's no such thing. If it's alive, it's complicated. So the arrangement from simple to complex was pure imaginary. Then each of the layers was assigned a fossil. For instance, graptolites were the index fossil for rocks that are 360 to 570 million years old. That was supposedly the age of the graptolites lived. So if you found a fossil containing a graptolite, the professor would say, oh, that's 500 million years old, without batting an eye. Until 3 years ago, when they found graptolites still alive in the South Pacific. There is some strong indication that there are some trilobites still alive. I think there is no such thing as an index fossil. The whole thing's baloney. But it's so well established in our textbooks that everybody's been taught this from kindergarten on. This is from the Jurassic period or the Cenozoic or Mesozoic or Paleozoic or whatever. I think the whole thing's a bunch of baloney. The geologic column is one of the great hindrances to modern science, in my opinion. Everything must be interpreted in light of what era it comes from, and it's all baloney. I think the flood did all those layers, or nearly all of the layers of the Earth, in just a few months. And the reason we find layers out of order according to the evolutionary expectation is because the evolutionary expectation is wrong. They could be found in any particular order. Generally, clams are found at the bottom, like I mentioned, because they're heavier, they can't run as fast, and that's where they live. Of course, they're the first ones buried. The fact that we find all these strata of the Earth, like you go to Grand Canyon, you can see hundreds of them exposed. The evolutionist will say each of these is a different age, oftentimes by many millions of years, and yet between the strata, there's no erosion. Don't you think if this layer was sitting there for 40 million years, there'd be some erosion take place? So the next layer would have to fill in the gap before it caused its layer to form. We don't see that. We see fine stratification numerous times. Distinct layers right smack on top of each other, which I think indicates they were rapidly formed in less than 1 year during this big flood. So I would reject the concept of simple life forms to begin with. And I would say the layers are not in order because the geologic column is a hoax. So it's a hindrance to science. I taught earth science for 15 years. Okay?
Yeah, I don't agree. And well, let's talk about the Grand Canyon. You just indicated that they're layer upon layer upon layer without any erosion. That suggests that they are in a sequence. And right. On top of that, so then the geological column, at least in the Grand Canyon, is a sequence and therefore is not a hoax. We have my experience in geology is a fair amount. I spent the better part of 10 years doing geological work associated with archaeology, and some of it was straightforward geology. I've seen monoclines, which are just basically flat beds that happen to have been tilted, where erosion has eroded them such that they look like synclines and anticlines. It's very difficult to look at the ground and actually interpret. You have to do a lot of groundwork. Where we have long sequences, such as in the Grand Canyon, not all of the beds are always in just one single continuous episode of deposition. We always have what are called cut and fill relationships. Sometimes we do see a surface which has been eroded. Sometimes we see substantial disconformities or nonconformities in cases where beds have been laid down in a continuous sequence. Then you have a period of erosion, then you have a period of upheaval. They all get twisted up this way, then they get eroded off this way, and then more beds are laid down on them that way. You see all sorts of situations on a continental basis. If we look at continental systems and we understand processes like isostasy, which causes thick depositions to float up out of the mantle and cause mountains to be built, as is happening on the West Coast, where these two big plates are coming together. When we understand that areas like the Central Plains were long-term seas, you don't get erosion on the bottom of a seabed. Where we have, what I would say your definition is perfect of some of the things, but what I would argue is that when I ask somebody to name a rock, or when I name a rock myself, I'm telling you about the conditions under which that rock formed. And if I see a long sequence of sedimentary rocks, then I'm talking about rocks that were formed in an ocean or in a lake. And you're not going to see erosion on those. So each situation is going to be different. And this is something I really wanted to say today, not only for my students, but just in this context. We have many different theories. Sometimes a part of a theory will be quite applicable to a part of the universe. And another theory is better for another part of the universe. We just had last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, I gave a lecture in which I espoused punctuated equilibrium as a particularly well handling the hominid sequence, and then my students went to another class and one of my colleagues said a punctuated equilibrium, worst theory in the history of science, you know. That happens, and that's fine. You know, we don't always agree on what the best interpretation for some specific body of data are going to be. So.
Any more questions line up? He mentioned the Grand Canyon is in sequence. I never disagreed with that. But I would say, how long did it take?
If we take the broader concept, it's the very question in the broader concept of that long-term geological column that will cause us to go out and investigate. And I always appreciate Kent bringing these questions to the front. Yeah.
My question is for Mr. Hovind. You mentioned Lucy, and you just mentioned the characteristics.
Speak up, please.
You mentioned Lucy, and you just mentioned the characteristics of like the thicker skull or the differently angled bones. I'd like you to extrapolate a little bit on your beliefs about the different hominid species, and then also Australopithecus. And it seems sort of like you're trying to just throw that out, or you're trying to consider them Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapiens.
Okay. Let me answer the question from one of the experts on this topic. The professor of anatomy at University of Southern California, Charles Oxnard, here's what he said about Lucy, the Australopithecines. In each case, initial studies suggest the fossils are similar to humans, or at least at the worst intermediate between humans and African apes. Study of the complete evidence readily shows that the reality is otherwise. These fossils clearly differ more from humans and African apes than these two living groups do from each other. The Australopithecines are unique. The various Australopithecines are indeed more different from both apes and humans in most features than the latter are from each other. Part of the basis of this acceptance has been the fact that even opposing investigators have found the large differences as they too used techniques and research designs that were less biased by prior notions as to what the fossils might have been. In this case, also, most of the new studies have come from laboratories independent of those representing individuals who found the fossils, which is a polite way of saying the guys who found these fossils have something they want to be true from their find, which is probably the case of any investigator. If they're looking to prove a particular point, they tend to interpret all of the evidence in light of their preconceived notions. You know, this is what they want to prove. In Donald Johansson's case, who found Lucy, Hadar Valley, Ethiopia, in 1974, Donald Johansson very much believes in evolution. And his finding of Lucy did indeed make him very famous, and he is still a very famous anthropologist today because of his finding of Lucy primarily. And yet, Charles Oxnard says the people who've analyzed these Australopithecines are saying they are just an unusual ape. They're not intermediate at all. They're just a dead end. And there is some strong indication in a place called Sumatra down near Vietnam that there are some of these upright walking chimpanzee-like animals, Lucy's, still alive. There was several articles been written about that in the last few years in different magazines on the possibility that whatever Lucy was, it's still alive. The footprints that were found, is it Laetoli, or how do you pronounce the name of that?
Not sure.
Laetoli, you know, they found the different footprints in the rock anyway, in the ash. They were perfectly normal human footprints. The right stride, the right castor, camber, everything, even the shape of the foot, except it was slightly wider than normal, which is what we would consider normal. A person that goes barefoot all of their life, their foot automatically widens out. But these footprints that were found in the rock, supposedly 3 million years old, were just exactly like ours today. But if you get the Time magazine article that covered this, they have the picture of this ape-like creature carrying a baby on their hip, you know, 3 feet tall, walking down these footprints. The footprints didn't give that indication at all. That was artists' that was a lie, in my opinion, okay? That's somebody who's already got a preconceived idea. We know evolution happened. Now we must find the proof. That's not the way science is supposed to work. You're supposed to approach the data without a bias at all. Here we find perfectly normal human footprints in rock that they say is 3 million years old. I would say, as an objective scientist, hey, this makes something wrong with your theory. So instead of trying to admit they're perfectly human, they try to characterize the people who are making these footprints as mostly ape. And the experts on Lucy are saying they're just an extinct, unusual form of monkey.
Well, what about Homo erectus, for instance? That's not an ape-like creature. And also, I would say, he's saying, well, there's evidence, but he's not pointing out the evidence in his article, and then you're talking about being an objective scientist. And I'm not trying to say anything against you,
Okay.
but if you're calling yourself a creation scientist, you're trying to prove creation, and you're not any more objective than someone who's trying to prove evolution.
Okay, as far as who gets to be a scientist, it seems to be in the modern world, if you don't believe in evolution, you're not a scientist. I mean, that is the attitude that is given off. I would disagree.
I'm saying that your approach wouldn't be any more objective than someone's approach who's trying to prove evolution.
Okay. Charles Oxnard, the article is published 1987. It's probably in your library here. It's called Fossils, Teeth, and Sex, New Perspectives on Human Evolution. I'll tell you what, I've got a stack of these down here. I buy them case at a time. It's all quotes from evolutionists who are experts in their field. You know, Stephen Gould, Niles Eldridge, many of these guys quoted in here. And it's all quotes by evolutionists on particular topics who are basically admitting, hey, look, we don't have any evidence. Charles Oxnard, I'm sure, believes in evolution, but he's just saying, look, Lucy is not a missing link. You may want it to be one because you need a missing link for your theory to look good, but I'm sorry, Lucy isn't it. If you want quotes on some of the other particular hominids, many of them are listed in here. I get these books, they're $2 a piece because I get them case at a time. If you want one, give me $2 and you can have one. But you can read what some of the experts have said. I've never seen the bones to Lucy, and I'm sure nobody in this room has ever seen the real bones to Lucy. We see copies of them, you know, but the real ones are locked in a vault someplace, you know, like it's the gold in Fort Knox. Well, there's no gold in Fort Knox, but they treat them like, you know, don't you dare touch this thing. And oftentimes when you get a copy or replica, which is what happened with the Piltdown fossils, they made these replicas that went all over the world, and people studied the replicas. But when they were allowed to study the real fossils, they found out there were filing marks on the teeth, indicating these had been filed down. This was a fraud. So I would like to see, by the time you see it in your textbook, this little scrap of bone that was found has now been reconstructed into a human or an ape-like creature, you know, long hair, and they got the dark eyes and typically dark skin. You would think that the African Americans would be very upset about, you know, nearly all the textbooks show intermediate stages as dark brown or black. You know, I think that's a little slam on the African Americans, and maybe not intentional, but that's the way it is in the books. So I think by the time you see it reconstructed, it is propaganda. If you saw the actual fossils, you'd say, that's a couple of scraps of bone. Unidentifiable normally. Or you can identify it however your preconceived idea goes. Some of the skulls are so thoroughly crushed, like Lucy, the skull was so thoroughly crushed, it was unidentifiable. The only evidence that he really went from was the little bit of the pelvis that they found and the femur. And yet, any monkey that climbs trees has an angled femur coming off the kneecap, just like humans do. So the fact that the femur goes off at an angle from the knee joint does not prove it's becoming a human. It might just be a tree-dwelling, abhorral simian, monkey, ape of some kind. And the fact that the bones are slightly bigger, that was his other evidence. Donald Johanson said the bones of Lucy are slightly bigger than a regular, you know, chimpanzee. Well, I say as a Bible-believing Christian, the Bible indicates the time before the flood came was a beautiful age. I mean, everything lived much longer and probably grew much bigger. So you're probably, if you do find ape fossils, they're going to be more in better health, more robust. It has nothing to do with evolution. It has to do with the fact that the pre-flood world was destroyed, and this flood is what caused the formation of the fossils. I mean, things don't fossilize unless they're buried quickly. Buffalo were killed by the millions out here in the prairies, you know, just last few hundred years, and yet I don't know of anybody that's ever found a fossilized buffalo bone. They find a few dried out still, but most of them, even those have been dissolved. Unless something is buried in mud, it doesn't fossilize. Finding fossils is not a problem. Trillions of fossils have been found. Finding a missing link is a problem, which is why many of the scientists are going to the theory that Dr. Prewitt mentioned a minute ago, punctuated equilibrium. Stephen Gould and Niles Eldridge kind of resurrected Goldschmidt's hopeful monster theory with a few little modifications. Basically, it is, what they're saying is, look, we don't find any missing links. So therefore, evolution happened rapidly. Big jumps or leaps, punctuations, or punctuated equilibrium. They call them saltationists. They're saying we don't find the missing links, therefore that proves it happened rapidly. I say, wait a minute, there's another obviously logical way to look at this. Maybe you don't find the missing links because it didn't happen at all. The argument is not between Darwinian gradualism, did it happen slowly and gradually, or, Stephen Gould's punctuated equilibrium, did it happen rapidly? I think there's another view on this we're not even giving to the kids. We're trying to make the kids decide, was it slow or fast? And we don't even throw in the third most logical option. Maybe it didn't happen at all. Why don't you get to the mics? Get to the mic so they can record this if you would.
While you're going back to the mic, I'll make a quick comment. I think we need to distinguish between taxonomic differentiation and phylogenetic relationship. The first step in dealing with fossils is to assign a taxon. Most fossil experts split first, lump later, so that, as I've explained to my classes, I learned a totally different fossil system 25 years ago than I'm teaching today. And the reason is we have many more fossils than we had then. Not all of the fossils that we deal with are on the human line. And indeed, what we've done is we've resolved from having 40 or 50 kinds of fossil hominids that are potentially pertinent to the human line to recognizing now Australopithecines, and not all Australopithecines are on the human line. There are substantial numbers of Australopithecines of types that are quite distinct. We have, in addition, the early genus, emergent genus Homo, and there's a great deal of discussion about Homo habilis, which was probably too tied up with Leakey's ego to. We probably will end up settling on another name. But if the punctuated theory ends up being the one that becomes a dominant theory, and there are about 6 different interpretations of the record right now, then some localized early genus Homo will give rise to a widespread Homo erectus population over a period of about 1 million years. It takes about 1 million years for that to happen. And then Homo erectus for 1 million years. And then an early, relatively localized constellation of features produces early Homo sapiens, and that erupts into a new system which includes probably Neanderthal, Upper Cave Choukoutian in China, and other forms that were around between 40 and 50,000 years ago and 125,000 years ago. So we have these 2 periods, and in those terms, human beings coming from about 40,000 years ago haven't been around very long at all. So we don't even know. Maybe we're not even a real form. Maybe we're just transitional, right? Yeah. Obviously, we're here, and the generation is a very short space. The generation is a very short space. Thomas Jefferson computed it at 19 years for some obscure reason, which is probably mystical. But I think, Kent's right. There are different theories to reconstruct the record within science. Scientific creationism is not the dominant one. There are a few people who still identify themselves as scientists who would consider themselves a creationist. However, for the most part, if you look at the credentials of those people, you'll find that their expertise in science is not in biology. Amanda. Or go ahead.
This is more towards Mr. Hovind. It seems like when we're talking about evolution and stuff like that, there's all these little glitches that people want explained before we believe in evolution. But as far as religion, you're a Christian?
Yes,
and
ma'am.
you go is it strictly by the King James Bible, or do you read like Hindu text, or is it just Christianity?
I happen to believe the Bible. I use the King James Version of the Bible. In 1610, I probably would have used something different. They didn't have the 1611 there. Yes, I'm Christian and believe the Bible, if that's your question.
Well, because it just seems like it just says, people try to pinpoint different things that are wrong, and scientists trying to prove evolution. I just don't understand how someone can take there's so many religions in the world, and they all start with, there's so many different myths that correlate, thousands of years before Christianity. There's myths, about
Leave the money there.
About like small little stories about men that kind of have the same story, like with Jesus, and when you're trying to find out how stuff like that fits, and how the Bible, it seems like everything in the Bible contradicts everything about human nature, and just little things like that. I don't understand how a person can take, trying to find a spirituality between, a person and a higher being, how they can pinpoint it on one small piece of scripture. And that was my question. How do you back up the fact that that's your main belief? When there's, like trying to talk about Jesus and what he was doing with his time and how he died for people's sins, and at the same time, I kind of see him as like a revolutionary, and he was fighting for all the things he said for, but he could have gone through, all his experiences and died, not just, because he wanted to save souls, but he was fighting for Jews, and he was fighting for freedom. So
I don't look at him necessarily as a revolutionary fighting. He could have caused a lot of trouble for the Roman Empire if he wanted, but he didn't seem to bother with them at all. I think he came to save our souls and died on the cross and then rose from the dead, which makes him different from all of the other people who claim to be the Messiah. As far as which Bible, again, we're off on a different subject. I don't know that we ought to go too far down that trail. On the creation-evolution argument, I think whether you believe in a creator or not makes a huge difference in many of the basic fundamental decisions you make in everyday life. Like, how do you decide if something's right or wrong? The abortion issue would be a classic example. If man is just an animal and we've evolved by blind random chance, and then there's no sanctity to human life, then of course abortion is a logical alternative. If you don't want this baby, go kill it. And I think that philosophy will lead to the next step, which is being debated in Europe right now. Should we allow the mothers to have the first year after the baby's born to decide if they want to keep it or not? Which will lead to the next logical step of, hey, Adolf Hitler, should we take these people that we feel are inferior and eliminate them? Euthanasia. Or genocide. It's a logical sequence from the theory of evolution. Whereas if creation is true, God created man and God decides. God makes those decisions. There has to be a grand says who, How do you decide what's right and wrong? I believe there's an absolute authority. I believe God Almighty created everything, and he has some thou shalts and some thou shalt nots. And if we base our government on God's law, we will have a system of government like our founding fathers gave us, a constitutional republic based on law. If we switch to the evolutionary philosophy, which we're doing in our country, you get a government based on democracy, which is, hey, what's the majority think? Which way's the wind blowing? And you go on majority rule. And democracies always degenerate into totalitarian governments, communism or something like that. And we're headed down that path very rapidly. Democracy to socialism to communism. It's just a matter really of probably a few years until America I think reaches the end of that path. So I think the philosophy of evolution versus creation affects many other things besides just biology, what you learn in school. It affects your thinkings on right and wrong, on morality, on ethics, as Dr. Prewitt would call it, instead of morals, on our type of government, on our medicine. You know, most doctors are taught the evolutionary philosophy that the body is a bunch of chemicals and you treat it with a bunch of drugs. Whereas the creationist view would say the body is designed by God, and God designed the food and minerals and nuts and berries and fruits to supply our needs, and most diseases can be cured with nutrition instead of with drug therapy. So it's a basic philosophical difference that you approach your discipline from, be it medicine or you know, a sick mind Freud and his teachings of, you know, man is just an animal, you know, and therefore you treat him as an animal mentally with mental diseases. I think it affects everything of life, which is why you mentioned there are many different religions in the world. I understand that, which is why I travel and speak so much. I'm trying to straighten them all out. I'm working on it.
I'm glad you mentioned Freud too. In the 19th century, there was some effort to try to figure out what was happening in the world. What was happening in the world that they probably, well, actually, Thomas Malthus talked about it, was that there was a huge population explosion. Malthus's concern was that we would outstrip our resources. Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx attacked the basic tenets of modernism, all of which are very closely linked with what has come to be called the curiously, the Judeo-Christian God and Western civilization. We live in a time where all of those other traditions you've spoken of are not only extant in the world, but at our fingertips. You can go home and probably pull up on your PC information about cultures. If I gave you a list of names that you'd never heard of, and you've got the information sitting in your home on a CD, you have all been exposed to music from all over the world that has nothing to do with the Western music tradition. It's a strange world we live in. There are some people who want to have that ground, that anchor, that is going to make this world seem palatable and acceptable. And within our culture, they're going to seek in the very traditions that have been the traditions of modernism to find that anchor, and certainly that's one very viable way of making one's way in the world. Christianity is a part of that. It's not the only part of it. Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, many other religions are a part of that. If God created the world by whatever means and through whatever agents, right? Then it also says if we take the scripture of Torah as our basis, it says in there that we are supposed to have dominion over. But that is, it seems to me, a responsibility, not a carte blanche to do as we please.
Right.
So it's sort of like the bumper sticker, which I won't quote exactly as it was, and that I saw in New Orleans. Jesus is coming, and boy is he upset. Kind of concern that I think that environmental concerns, you'll hear people of all different types saying environmental concerns are very bad, very, very bad for our society, you know. Why are environmental concerns very bad for our society? It's your children, and you as our children, who are at risk as a consequence of how we treat this world. So I think there's some common ground in some of the things that we talk about from our different perspectives that needs to be constantly addressed. You ask a good question. What about all these other traditions? We should also ask the question, why do we accept the traditions we accept? Part of that is historical. Part of it is simply because it's what we know. Part of it's because that's the way Granny was. But indeed, we live in a time where we have to make very personal decisions on these things. And there's not a lot of people out there that are going to help you make that decision in some cases. If you go, you don't have to go very far off this campus to get to a place where there are people who won't really care much about what decision you're making, as long as they can get from you what they want to get. let's take that. Other than that, and we'll come back to those.
Tell them to go to the mic, too.
Yeah. Come to the mic if you have a question.
I have a question for Mr. Hovind. You date creation at 6,000 years ago, but radiocarbon dating and other means show it's, even Lucy is about 3 million years ago. So I was wondering how you explain those differences.
Okay, obviously I would say that the radiocarbon dating, and there are 6 or 7 different methods used primarily, there's others available, are based on some very fundamental assumptions, and they're faulty based on their assumptions. If you want to take just radiocarbon dating, carbon-14, we could go for a couple of days explaining how it works and the problems, the assumptions it's based on. The science part of it is good, but the fundamental underlying assumptions are what they don't seem to look at. A good analogy that helps people understand, if you had walked into the room today and found a candle burning on the table, and I ask you a question, how long has it been burning? You say, I don't know. It was burning when I walked in. Well, let's see if we can figure it out scientifically. We can do some scientific things to that candle. That's called empirical science. We could measure the candle. Let's suppose, for sake of analogy here, the candle is 7 inches tall. We can measure the candle very precisely. We could get a micrometer and get it down to 1/10,000th of an inch, if you'd like. But knowing the height of the candle is 7 inches does not tell me how long it's been burning. We need some more facts to apply to this. Let's measure how fast the candle burns. That we can also do scientifically. We can get an Olympic stopwatch and measure it to the nearest, 1,000th of a second. Let's say the candle is burning 1 inch every hour, and it is 7 inches tall. Those are 2 facts from science that we can ascertain to a high degree of accuracy. But that still doesn't tell me how long the candle's been burning. Now I have to take those facts that I've obtained scientifically and apply some fundamental assumptions to it. Number 1, how tall was the candle when it started? That we have no idea. Number 2, has it always burned at the same rate? Just because we watched it burn an inch in an hour does not mean it's always burned an inch an hour. So my answer to how long the candle's been burning is only as good as my assumptions. Carbon dating, potassium-argon dating, uranium-238, uranium-235, rubidium, strontium, lead-208 to lead-206, it doesn't matter which method you use. The scientific part of gathering the information, of counting the molecules and counting the decay rate, I don't argue with that. It's very scientific. Today's rate of carbon decay is probably half-life of about 5,760 years. Some say 790, some say 730. Okay, it's about 5,700 years. I don't argue with that. That's a fact of science. But you're going to apply that fact to dating a fossil, you're going to have to make some assumptions. You're going to have to assume that the fossil you're dating contained, when it died and was buried, the same amount of carbon-14 in its body that we have today, which is a great assumption that is certainly unprovable. You're going to have to assume that the rate of decay that we are observing is what it has always been. You're going to have to assume there's been no contamination for all these thousands of years as the fossil laid there in the sediment layers. That's a very great assumption, totally unprovable. And that's also, by the way, the ace in the hole that the evolutionists will use to reverse a date if it doesn't match the theory. When Leakey found his famous skull, ER-1470, he found it under a layer of volcanic ash or tuft called the KBS tuft, after K. Brennemeyer, whatever her name was, who named this layer of volcanic ash. This layer of volcanic stuff was dated at like 280 million years old. That was the accepted date in the textbooks. If you find anything below this date, it's more than 280 million. And that was accepted. It was tested by many different methods and accepted as 280 million until they found this perfectly normal human skull underneath. Well, if you got a perfectly normal human skull that's now 280 million years old, well, that throws all evolution out the window. At least it upsets everything in the textbooks. And so they went back and scrambled to redate the KBS tuft to a more acceptable age. The fact of the matter is that carbon dating, potassium-argon dating, they're all based on some assumptions, and it really, all of them have to bow to the preconceived evolutionary paradigm. Dr. Prewitt talked about a paradigm, a worldview that shifts, sometimes. I think we need to shift this one. The theory of evolution would have been thrown out long ago if it weren't for the fact that the only option is creation. And in the minds of the naturalistic scientists, that you have to explain it naturally. Suppose I said, I want you to explain how this Casio watch formed, but you're not allowed to go to Japan. You're not allowed to find out who designed it. I want a purely naturalistic explanation. And if it involves anything of a designer, the explanation is no longer naturalistic. Well, you're going to be stopped at square one. There is no way to explain the origin of a Casio databank watch that holds 150 phone numbers without resorting to there must have been a designer, and intelligence went behind this. The fact that you can't go see that designer, I'm sorry, that's just, that's the way it is. In our modern science at this university, the preconceived attitude is if it involves a creator, if it involves something outside of science that's untestable or observable, therefore it's not science. I think that's a great disservice to science. And I think you'd find all of the early scientists of the last 400 years, you know, that developed all of our branches of science were very active, avid creationists. Now, they differed theologically. They weren't all independent Baptists like me, but they were most of them saying, hey, there must have been a designer. So as far as Lucy being dated at 3.2 million years old, or these different fossils being dated so many million or billion years old, I think it's all baloney. I think what happened with the moon rocks is a classic example. If you get Science magazine out of your library right here, get the January edition from 1970, I forget the volume number, but you'll find in there that what happened when they brought the moon rocks back from 1969, you know, the trips to the moon, they brought some rocks back. They took one rock and broke it up into 9 pieces and gave it to 9 different laboratories and said, how old is it? No strings attached, just tell me how old it is. They got 9 different answers back. Each laboratory had a different age. The ages from this same rock ranged from 1/2 billion to 18 billion. We're talking the same rock. So obviously there are some problems with all of the dating methods, and I think it's because they're based on some very fundamental assumptions. And I can assure you, if you'll research the literature, you'll find out that if a radiometric date is obtained from a sample that doesn't match the geologic column acceptable date, the radiometric date is rejected. No questions asked. If they know, if I give them a dinosaur bone and say, how old is it? They've already decided it's about 65 million to 140 million years old, or 225 million. They give it a range in the Cretaceous or Jurassic period. So they're looking for that number as an answer. Therefore, they wouldn't even attempt to carbon date it, because carbon dating only goes back 30, 50, maybe to 50,000 years. They would pick a different method that would give a number in that range. Which is why 2 or 3 years ago, when they found the dinosaur bones in Antarctica that were not even fossilized, they were fresh, preserved, frozen dinosaur bones, still containing carbon. They didn't carbon date them because it would have come back with a number of less than 50,000 years. And that's not the number they want. It wouldn't fit the theory. So the dating methods are all based on the assumption that evolution is true. That is presumed to be true and indisputable fact. And now any scientific observations must fit this ancient paradigm from the 19th century, which I think is a hindrance to science. That's not the way it ought to be done. Does that answer your question?
If there were dinosaur bones in Antarctica and they dated at that point, I would expect to see a theoretical revision. But I want to address the question as well. Much of what Kent says is correct. There are premises involved with the C14 dating technique and other radiometric dating techniques. Most of the earlier radiometric dating techniques are relative techniques more than absolute techniques. That is, they give you such broad ranges of date estimation that they're really pretty worthless from the point of view of saying when exactly did this happen. But they're very good if you have a sequence of things from similar context that can sort of help you relatively order the things. The C14 dating technique illustrates a scientific method at its best. It is not the case that where expected dates are not obtained, people reject the dates out of hand, no questions asked. And indeed, there is in archaeological context of all of a much more recent date. C14 is really irrelevant to evolution because, with the exception that it is one of the radiometric techniques. But as far as dating the human record, it is simply deals with too recent a time span. 50,000 years isn't enough. You know, we got to have 51,000 years at least. We can actually do a variety of things with C14 that show the limitations of the technique and that also show how science works. One is, one of the assumptions that's a bad assumption that was made by Libby in 1950 was that the amount of C14 in the atmosphere is constant. It hasn't been constant. It has changed drastically over the time that materials, over the time of the materials that we can date. So if we take a constant and apply it to an old material, we're getting a bad estimation of date. And the estimation was sufficiently different at a point, say, 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, that it was sufficient that when we were in areas where we had calendrical dating systems in Egypt, and we knew that what the date was precisely to year within 10 years, and the only difference was an interpretation of a couple of glyphs. There were two systems, and they were 10 years different. We'd C14 material from well-defined context and find that the date was far off, that the date appeared to be much more recent than it was supposed to be. In those areas where we had calendrical dates, or where we had also what are called horizon marker artifacts, not fossils, where something would come into style and just spread over the whole eastern Mediterranean, people had a pretty good sense of what the archaeological sites dated. And so when they were getting these dates that were far too recent, they just said, no, we won't use it. C14 is not reliable, we just won't use it. The C14 people were baffled by the fact that they were getting the difference between these dates. In Western Europe, on the other hand, where we did not have good calendrical dates, people were routinely using C14 for their dating. Finally, what they did was they took 10-year segments of bristlecone pines, which they had a dendrochronological sequence of known date back about 3,500, and then pieces of it back as far as 4,000 years, which is within Kent's time frame. So it could be useful whether or not he or I are correct on the broader debate here. The bristlecone pines were dated. They dated multiple samples in 10-year segments over the broad span, and what you always get is a statistical distribution of dates. You usually get one date that's bad high, one date that's bad low, and then a cluster of dates. That's why you get a C14 date that says plus or minus so many years. It's a single standard deviation statistical computation. At any rate, what they were able to show was that they were able to plot. They had reversed the logic and said, okay, if this is the amount of C14 and the half-life is not in contest, the half-life has been revised in recent years, but on the level of only about 1 or 2% of the total half-life that it originally had manifested. So half-life is going to be relatively constant. If we assume the half-life is constant, we look at this amount of C14 and we know the date of the thing, all right, what must have been the original C14 content in the item? And by doing that, they were able to produce a chart which allows you then to correct the original error on all your previous dates. So they went back to the bad dates they had from earlier sites. They pulled those dates up, corrected them with the chart, and they all hit statistically in the areas where the calendrical dates said they were supposed to be. So C14, we do have a means of correcting. There are other problems with it. For example, certain grasses and corn and other plants absorb more, they absorb C14 at a different rate, and they have, in terms of quantities of carbon relative to total mass, different proportions than other plants. So if you date corn and you date oak from the same context, you'll get slightly different dates because of these differences in biochemical structure. These are all things that can be worked with, discovered, analyzed, interpreted, and brought into the system. It does illustrate how really shaky a lot of the dating system is. Geologists, again, are human. God, being a hugely sinister practical joker, has laid this fossil record before us, and so we have to muddle through as best we can. I hope that's responsive. Let's take the flip and talk about Genesis.
Authorship of Genesis.
Authorship
Good.
of
Okay.
Genesis. Go ahead.
I believe if you look, even a cursory reading of this whole Scripture will indicate that most of the New Testament writers refer to Moses as being the author of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but not necessarily the author of Genesis. He was probably the collector of Genesis. There is a phrase used in the book of Genesis. I believe there are 7 times, it may be 10 times, but it says, "These are the generations of." These are the generations of Esau. These are the generations of Adam. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. I think what happened with the book of Genesis, God wrote the first chapter and a half, and Adam wrote some of the book of Genesis up until the next marker, "These are the generations of." This was then passed on down to the next person, maybe Seth or Enoch or one of these guys, who then took the previous 2 that had been given to him and added his direct observations. He was there. Noah, or one of his sons, Shem, Ham, or Japheth, wrote another section. And so when you get to the end of the book of Genesis, you have a collection of writings of about 7 or 8 different eyewitnesses. They saw it happen. Noah would have taken the previous records on board the ark with him. And so I think everything in Genesis is an eyewitness account as it happened. You're going to have differences of style because you have different authors, no question. Moses was the editor. He collected all this data. And this was all under the inspiration of God, I believe, even down to the very placing of the letters. The recent research with the Hebrew text of running all the letters into a computer in one continuous string of letters with no spaces for the words or sentences. When they told the computer to pick out every 7th letter, for instance, or every 12th letter, or every 20th letter, they found that spaced throughout the Hebrew text were many key words and word pairs put together, even to the point where they took the book showing the 65 most prominent Jews alive today, and they could find their names in the text with Genesis, equidistant letter spacing, including their birth date. Equidistant letter spacing. The research that's been going on for the last 7 years in the Hebrew letter spacing is phenomenal, indicating not only did God inspire the general idea, he put letter for letter, word for word, sentence for sentence, precisely what he wanted. I think the book of Genesis is incredibly complex, undoubtedly inspired of God, but God used different men to actually write the letter on the paper. And so Moses was the final editor of this book, but he took the actual writings of eyewitness accounts of these different various people and put them together. And you can read through Genesis, and every time you see "these are the generations of," make a mark there. You're going to somebody else now who's going to be writing. And God even supervised or superintended the style and everything else. He made sure it came out inspired, infallible, and inerrant. That's my stand on the book of Genesis.
The Toledoth segment, which is "these are the generations of" segment, is a pro forma phrase that's used. I counted 5 key Toledoth segments in Genesis, but they continue into Exodus and throughout Torah. Each of those is intended precisely to do exactly what Kent said, that is to introduce a new section which is intended within a general editorship to represent something different. It's sort of like Monty Python's "and now for something completely different," kind of thing, although not perhaps that secular. The text itself is based upon oral traditions, a variety of oral traditions. If you look at Genesis 1 to 11, you have a wider variety of oral traditional types represented within the segments, and you have less conflation of different types. By conflation, I mean if you had story of Little Red Riding Hood A and story of Little Red Riding Hood B, and you stuck them together like that, not often being really careful about the inconsistencies that might occur. For example, Hagar has a child who is a child Ishmael. Then a lot of other things happen. Ishmael gets to be 13 years old. He's circumcised with Abraham. And then when Sarah finally has Isaac, she makes Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away. And so Hagar takes a bottle of water and the child on her shoulder and walks out into the desert. What's wrong with this picture? You know, Hagar's carrying a 13-year-old boy off into the desert on her shoulder. I don't think so, all right? And when those conflations came together, they were not intended. I mean, you know, people understood that there was a little bit of a logical problem with one aspect of it, but the intent of that kind of story construction is to create a larger plot sequence, or a larger, what Aristotle called mythos. Mythos is the structure of the events, or the plot of the story. So you've got a story and you have some genealogies. All of the segments now, standard biblical criticism recognizes what they call the priestly source, what they call the Yahwist source, which is labeled J because these were mainly German scholars, and so they labeled it J because Yahwist would be spelled with a J. The Elohist source, which was E, and then there's the Deuteronomic source, which doesn't appear in Genesis at all, at any rate, and the Levitican source. So we have, within Genesis, though, certainly we have P, which is actually many different things. A good example of a P story would be Genesis 14, the story of the War of the Five Kings against the Four. Another example of a P story is, in fact, Genesis 1. All right. Genesis 2 is primarily Yahwist, although it does involve some conflation. The only pure E that exists in Genesis, according to the standard biblical criticism, is Genesis 22. It's called the binding, or the Hebrew for the name for the piece is the binding, or the binding of Isaac. All right. The sections of Genesis also, like other sections of Torah, have names. So, for example, the section of law in Exodus, the Mishpatim, is intended to be supposed to be the earliest example of law in the Old Testament. It's actually maybe even later than Genesis in some ways. You have a lot of oral tradition that's been brought together and compiled by someone. I don't think that someone was one individual. I don't think it was Moses, but certainly a group of priests at some time, brought to an extant text and recited as part of Jewish religious observances, and then related also to the prophecies in what are called the Haftarah. So you have the Torah and the Haftarah. When you have the whole notion of the recitation is even more important, because when it was first written down, the Hebrew Bible was written down only with consonants. There were no vowels. And so those consonants were the strings, and I don't know if they were skipping the vowels when they were doing these every 7-letter things, but I would certainly want to ask that. But there were no vowels, only consonants, and so when a person did the recitation, the consonants were there as a kind of a mnemonic device to get them through the text if they were reading. That introduces the possibility that different communities could actually vocalize the text at critical points in slightly different ways. One of the things that was going on in the 16th century was that there were people who were saying, well, we don't really know what the Hebrew was. If we could get the correct word, the real Hebrew word, they felt at that time that the word gave you power over the thing, that the word was merely another aspect of the thing, and that's what a lot of magic was tied up in, trying to understand the word that God actually used, and then you could command the thing. So we've had a lot of strange notions about this text. All right. At any rate, when the text was carried to its present form, and that was probably at least 1,000 years before Jesus. About 500 BC, And I argue that many aspects of the compilation of Genesis may be post-exilic, that is either composed orally or in written form during the exile and shortly thereafter. But by 500 BC, a group called the Masoretes vocalized the text. They put marks in the text to indicate what the vowels ought to be, and at that point the text became fixed in meaning. They also put in marks to indicate the sounds, the song, what Aristotle would have called the melopolia of the text, so that it could be recited in the right voice. There's a lot of poetry in the text. It's a powerful text, and it is not one to be taken lightly. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were names spelled out in the every 7 letters. Neither would the Kabbalists of the first and that were developing in the 1st and 2nd century. So my response to the question of the origins of the text is that it is written out of oral tradition. It was put into its present form at least 1,000 years before Jesus. It was vocalized about 500 BC. Jesus referred to the text as an extant text as law. It was law to Jesus. It was the law. But in the Jewish tradition, understand that law is stated and law is interpreted. And there are big debates over what things mean, whether Hagar was a concubine or a wife, or whether she was a surrogate mother or not. These are the kind of things that I was just having that argument in my office yesterday morning. Just going back and forth about whether Hagar was really a wife or not, And that's the way the Jewish tradition deals with these things. The idea of the Jewish tradition is that the law, or the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are like our Constitution. Our Constitution is a relatively immutable body of stuff that we refer everything back to. And that's what the Torah is. It's an immutable body of law, the Word of God, that everything gets referred back to. So there's this huge tradition of interpretation, which of course Catholicism was not particularly interested in, but Protestant Christianity began to reinvestigate and also to interpret on their own. So it's old, it's important, you should study it.